I didn't just execute Anne Boleyn. He took away the one person she loved most. The last thing Anne Boleyn wanted wasn't mercy. It wasn't freedom. It was one final chance. Imagine knowing you'll die tomorrow, and never being allowed to hold your child one last time. And her final letter reveals a heartbreak history almost forgot. Whether she was ever given that chance remains one of the greatest heartbreaks in Tudor history. And in the Tower of London, as Anne waited for death, she left behind words that continue to haunt historians nearly 5 centuries later. This isn't just the story of a queen who lost her crown. It's the story of a mother who lost everything. Before we begin, if you enjoy true stories that history almost forgot, subscribe. Every week we uncover the forgotten lives behind the English crown. May 1536. The Tower of London had seen countless prisoners, traitors, rebels, princes, queens, but none entered its gates quite like Anne Boleyn. Only 3 years earlier, she had entered Westminster Abbey wearing cloth of gold while thousands cheered her name. Now she entered the tower by boat, silent, guarded. Accused of crimes almost no one truly believed. The same fortress that welcomed English kings before their coronation had become the prison where England's queen waited to die. Outside, London buzzed with rumors. Some claimed Anne had bewitched the king. Others whispered that she had betrayed him. Many simply watched, unsure what to believe. Inside the tower, Anne knew something everyone else refused to admit. This wasn't really about adultery, or treason, or justice. Henry VIII had already decided her fate. The trial would simply provide the excuse. For years, Anne Boleyn had been the woman Henry believed he could never live without. He pursued her relentlessly. He challenged the authority of Rome. He broke England away from the Catholic Church. He ended one marriage, changed an entire kingdom, risked everything, all because he wanted Anne Boleyn to become his queen. History often remembers Henry as the man who married 6 wives, but before all of that, there was Anne. She wasn't simply another queen, she was his obsession until she wasn't. Everything changed after one heartbreaking reality. Anne did not give Henry the son he desperately wanted. Instead, she gave birth to a daughter. The little girl was named Elizabeth. No one knew then that this tiny child would one day become one of England's greatest monarchs. But in 1533, Elizabeth wasn't a future queen. She was simply another disappointment in Henry's eyes. Every failed pregnancy that followed deepened the distance between husband and wife. Where Anne saw a family, Henry saw a failed dynasty. Where Anne saw hope, Henry saw another obstacle. The king who had once written love letters by the dozen slowly stopped writing at all. His attention drifted elsewhere, toward another quiet lady at court, Jane Seymour. Anne understood court politics better than almost anyone. She noticed every glance, every whispered conversation, every sudden silence when she entered a room. She knew exactly what was happening. She had once replaced another queen. Now someone else was replacing her. Then came the accusations: adultery, incest, conspiracy against the king. Charges so shocking they spread across England like wildfire. 5 men were arrested. Among them was Anne's own brother, George Boleyn. Most modern historians believe the accusations were fabricated or at least impossible to prove. But truth no longer mattered. The verdict had already been written. The courtroom merely became the stage. Witnesses remembered Anne trying to remain composed. Sometimes she laughed unexpectedly. Sometimes she prayed. Sometimes she spoke so quickly that even her guards struggled to understand her. To modern eyes, her behavior seems strange. But imagine carrying the knowledge that every sunrise might be your last. Fear rarely looks calm. It often looks exactly like Anne. During these long days inside the tower, one person remained painfully absent. Elizabeth, her daughter, wasn't allowed to visit. No final embrace, no final kiss, no final goodbye. History leaves us frustratingly silent on exactly what Anne thought each night as she lay awake inside her chamber. But it isn't difficult to imagine where her heart wandered. Not toward the crown she had lost, not toward the jewels that had been taken, not even toward Henry, toward her child. Elizabeth was only 2 years old, far too young to understand why her mother had disappeared. One day Anne had been Queen of England, the next, she simply vanished from her daughter's life. Children that young don't understand politics. They only understand absence. Perhaps Elizabeth waited for footsteps that never came. Perhaps she asked questions no one wished to answer. Perhaps no one answered at all. Anne, meanwhile, had nothing left except time. Time to remember, time to pray, time to think. She had entered Henry's life believing love could change the world. In many ways, it had. England had changed forever because of their relationship. Churches, kings, parliament, religion itself, nothing would ever be the same. Yet the woman who helped reshape England would not live long enough to see what she had begun. One of the few surviving letters connected to Anne during these final days is her appeal to Henry VIII after her arrest. Whether every line reflects her own hand continues to be debated by historians. But the emotion within it has echoed through history for centuries. She did not curse him. She did not threaten revenge. Instead, she pleaded for justice. She reminded Henry that he had once called her his faithful wife. She asked only that her case be judged fairly, not out of love, out of truth. There is something deeply heartbreaking about those words, because by then, Henry had already moved on, while Anne prayed for fairness inside the Tower. Preparations for Jane Seymour quietly continued outside its walls. The future queen waited while the present queen waited for death. Perhaps the cruelest part wasn't the execution itself. It was the silence. No message from Henry, no final meeting, no explanation. The man who had crossed kingdoms to marry her could not spare even one last farewell. For Anne, that silence may have spoken louder than any sentence a court could ever pronounce. Because sometimes, the deepest betrayal isn't hatred. It's being forgotten by the person who once promised never to forget you. The trial began on May 15, 1536. By then, Anne Boleyn already understood something that almost no one in the courtroom dared to say aloud. The verdict had been decided long before anyone spoke. The judges weren't there to discover the truth. They were there to make Henry VIII's decision look like justice. As Anne entered the Great Hall of the Tower of London, every eye followed her. This was no ordinary prisoner. She was still the Queen of England. Only days earlier, nobles had bowed before her. Now those same men refused to meet her eyes. Some lowered their heads. Others stared in silence. No one wanted to be remembered as the person who defended a queen the king wanted dead. The charges sounded unbelievable. She had supposedly betrayed her husband with several men. Musicians, courtiers, friends, even her own brother, George Boleyn. It was one of the most shocking accusations in Tudor history. Modern historians have found no convincing evidence that incest ever happened. Many believe the charge existed for only one reason: to make forgiveness impossible. If England believed Anne had committed adultery, some people might have pitied her, but if England believed she had committed incest, no one would dare defend her. The accusations were designed not only to destroy her life, but to destroy her memory. When Anne spoke, witnesses described her as calm, clear, intelligent. She answered every accusation directly. Again and again, she denied every charge. She didn't beg, she didn't scream, she simply asked for justice. But justice had already left the room. The jury needed very little time. Guilty, one word. That was all it took. Years of loyalty, years of sacrifice, years beside the king, reduced to a single sentence. The punishment was death. As Anne was led away, another trial was already unfolding. Her brother, George Boleyn, brother and sister had grown up together. They shared books, ideas, faith. Now they shared something far darker, the same execution order. George also denied every accusation. It made no difference. He too was condemned. On May 17, only 2 days after Anne's conviction, George Boleyn climbed the scaffold. He was executed before his sister. Imagine the cruelty. Anne didn't simply wait for death. She waited knowing the people she loved were dying one by one. Back inside the tower, time moved strangely. Some hours felt endless. Others disappeared without warning. Witnesses remembered Anne praying often, then suddenly laughing, then becoming silent again. Modern psychologists might call it trauma. The human mind struggling beneath unbearable pressure. Yet through every emotional storm, one thought kept returning. Elizabeth, her little girl, was only 2 years old. Too young to remember her mother's voice. Too young to understand why everyone suddenly stopped saying Anne's name. History never records Anne asking to see Elizabeth. Perhaps she knew the answer before she asked, or perhaps the request was simply never granted. Either way, the silence became another punishment. One final goodbye never came. Outside the tower, life continued. Merchants opened their shops. Children played in the streets. Church bells rang as they always had, and somewhere beyond those ancient walls, little Elizabeth lived another ordinary day, completely unaware that she was living the final days of having a mother. She couldn't know that within days. She would officially become illegitimate, her title removed, her future uncertain, her mother's name spoken only in whispers. History often remembers Anne Boleyn as Henry's second wife. But Elizabeth remembered something much simpler, or perhaps one day wished she could. A mother she barely had the chance to know. Then came another wound, one that history often overlooks. Henry VIII never came, not once. No final conversation, no explanation, no forgiveness, no goodbye. Years earlier, he had crossed political boundaries, broken centuries of tradition, defied the Pope himself, just to marry Anne Boleyn. Now, he couldn't spare a single visit. Instead, preparations quietly began for another wedding, Jane Seymour, only days after Anne's death. Henry would become engaged to Anne. That truth may have hurt more than the execution itself. People can survive hatred. They rarely survive being replaced. Inside her chamber, Anne turned increasingly toward prayer, not because she expected a miracle, but because faith was the only thing no king could take away. Witnesses described her speaking with remarkable peace at moments, almost as though she had already accepted where her journey would end. She confessed her sins. Not the crimes she had been accused of, but the ordinary failures every human carries. She prepared herself, not for another trial, but for eternity. Then came the message. The execution would not be carried out with the traditional English axe. Henry had ordered something unusual, a swordsman from France. Many later interpreted it as an act of mercy. A skilled swordsman could end a life more quickly than an inexperienced executioner with an axe. Perhaps Henry believed this final gesture would ease his conscience. Perhaps it was simply practical. No one can know, but history remembers the irony. The king who ordered her death also ordered that she should die as painlessly as possible. Mercy, arriving only after mercy no longer mattered. That night, Anne hardly slept. How could anyone? Every sound echoed differently when you knew it might be your last night on earth. A guard changing shifts, a distant church bell. Footsteps in the corridor, every noise reminded her. Morning was coming, somewhere in England. Elizabeth was sleeping peacefully, unaware that dawn would change her life forever. Anne would never watch her grow, never hear her first real conversations, never celebrate another birthday, never tell her who she truly was. History cannot tell us Anne's final private thoughts. But almost every parent understands this kind of heartbreak, not fearing your own death, but grieving the life you will never share with your child. And perhaps that was the cruelest sentence of all. The morning arrived, May 19, 1536. The Tower of London was unusually quiet, no cheering crowds, no grand ceremony. Only a small wooden scaffold had been raised inside the tower walls. Henry VIII did not want a public spectacle. He wanted it finished, quickly, silently, forever, before sunrise. Anne dressed carefully. Witnesses noticed something remarkable. She did not wear black. She chose a dark gray gown with a crimson petticoat beneath it. Simple, elegant, royal. She wanted to meet death with dignity, not as a frightened prisoner, but as the Queen of England, even if England no longer called her one. Outside, the French executioner waited. His sword was razor-sharp. Unlike the heavy English axe, it would end everything in a single stroke. Perhaps that was Henry's final act of mercy, or perhaps it was simply another way to erase her more efficiently. No one knows. As Anne climbed the wooden steps, the crowd fell silent. Some people had come out of curiosity, others out of loyalty. Many simply wanted to witness history, yet standing before them, Anne looked nothing like the monster described during her trial. She looked exhausted, thin, peaceful, almost impossibly calm. Then she began to speak, not with anger, not with hatred, not with revenge. She thanked those who had cared for her. She asked the people to pray for the king. "I pray God save the king and send him long to reign over you." Those words have puzzled historians for centuries. Why bless the man who had condemned you? Perhaps because Anne no longer wished to fight. Perhaps because bitterness could not change what waited only moments away. Or perhaps she believed that forgiveness was the last freedom Henry could never take from her. When her speech ended, she removed her headdress. One of her ladies gently tied her long dark hair beneath a linen cap. Anne smiled softly at the women beside her. They were crying. She wasn't. Then, she knelt. She closed her eyes. And she whispered one final prayer. To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. The executioner stood behind her, hidden from her sight. He quietly called for his sword, not because he needed it, but to distract her for one final second. Anne turned her head toward the sound, and in that instant, the blade fell. It was over almost before anyone realized it had begun. She was about 35 years old. The woman for whom Henry VIII had changed England was gone. There was no royal funeral, no magnificent tomb, no procession worthy of a queen. Her body was placed inside a simple wooden chest that had once been used to store arrows. Imagine that, the Queen of England, buried in a box made for weapons. She was laid to rest in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the Tower of London, quietly, without ceremony, without the husband who had once promised to love her above all others. And what of Henry VIII? Only 11 days after Anne's execution, he married Jane Seymour. Life at court moved on with astonishing speed. Music returned. Celebrations resumed. It was as if Anne Boleyn had never existed, or at least, that was the plan, but history has a way of refusing to forget. Henry believed he had erased Anne forever. Instead, time gave her something he never expected, a legacy, because the little girl Anne never saw again did survive, Elizabeth, the daughter Henry once declared illegitimate. The child many believed would never matter. She grew up without her mother's embrace, without her mother's guidance, without even the right to call herself a princess for many years, yet she endured. In 1558, Elizabeth became Queen of England, against every expectation, against every prediction, against every obstacle placed in her path. She ruled for 44 years. Longer than any Tudor monarch before her. England entered an age of exploration, art flourished, the kingdom became stronger, and history would remember her by a single name, Elizabeth the Great. The daughter Henry once overlooked became the greatest achievement of Anne Boleyn's life. Perhaps that is the greatest irony in Tudor history. Henry spent years searching for a son to secure his legacy. Instead, his greatest legacy came through the daughter he never truly valued. The child Anne loved changed England forever. As for Anne, centuries later, visitors still walk through the Tower of London. Some stop at the chapel where she rests. Others stand where the scaffold once stood. Many arrive expecting to learn about a queen. They leave remembering a woman, a mother, a prisoner, a wife betrayed, a life reduced to accusations that historians still debate. But one truth remains beyond debate. Anne Boleyn changed the course of English history, not because she wore a crown, but because even after her death, the future belonged to her daughter. And perhaps that is why Anne was never truly erased. The king could silence her voice. He could take her crown, he could even take her life, but he could never stop history from remembering her name. If Anne Boleyn's story moved you, subscribe for more untold stories of the Tudors, stories of forgotten queens, impossible choices, and the people history almost erased. Because sometimes, the most powerful person in history is the one who never lived long enough to tell their own story.